The first thing Cale noticed about the child was that she did not flinch. He had been cutting sutures out of a Torelin freight handler's forearm. The man had caught a cargo hook 2 days ago and the wound was healing crooked, when the tent flap snapped open and a body hit the ground between 2 cots. Not fell, hit. The difference mattered. A fall had weight distributed, limbs catching themselves, the body negotiating with gravity. This was something thrown, and it landed with the particular sound of a frame too small to absorb the impact it had been given. Cale set the suture scissors down. The freight handler swore. 2 soldiers in unmarked gray armor stepped through the tent flap, and behind them came a third, taller, thinner, wearing a rank sash that Cale did not recognize but understood immediately. Authority, the kind that did not ask permission. The child pushed herself off the ground. She was small enough that standing put her head below the level of the nearest cot's mattress. Her skin was the color of river ice, pale blue-white, translucent at the temples where the veins branched in patterns Cale had never seen in any species he had treated. Her ears were long and pointed, swept back against a skull covered in fine silver-white hair that had been cut unevenly, as though someone had done it with a blade not designed for the task. Her eyes were enormous, the irises a pale gold that caught the tense surgical lighting and held it. She was shaking, fine tremors that ran through her frame in waves, the kind produced by adrenaline and cold and sustained effort not to make a sound. But she did not flinch. She stood on the packed earth floor of the medical tent, barefoot, wearing a shift made of some fabric Cale could not identify, thin, gray, torn at the shoulder, and she looked directly at the officer with the rank sash, and her expression was not fear. It was something older than fear, something that had passed through fear and come out the other side as a decision. "This one was found in the transit column," the officer said. His voice was clipped, efficient, the consonants filed to points. "Species, Larian. Status, unclaimed. The Larian Protectorate delegation has filed a recovery order. She's to be held until their retrieval unit arrives." Cale looked at the child. The child looked at the officer. Neither of them looked at Cale. "This is a medical tent," Cale said. "I can see that. It's not a holding facility. It's a structure with walls and a door flap that closes, Sergeant, which makes it more secure than anything else in this camp. The retrieval unit will arrive before nightfall. Keep her contained until then." Cale had been a field medic for 14 years. Before that he had been a combat surgeon on 3 deployments, and before that he had been a medical student who had joined the service because civilian residencies paid less than the rent on his apartment, and he had a talent for keeping his hands steady when things around him were not. He had sutured wounds in sandstorms, set broken bones during firefights, delivered a baby in the back of an armored transport that was taking indirect fire. He had learned, across all of those years, a simple operational truth. The people who brought you problems in clipped, efficient voices were usually the ones creating them. "What did she do?" Cale asked. "That's not your concern. If I'm containing her, it is." The officer's mouth thinned. He looked at Cale with the expression of a man who was not accustomed to having his instructions questioned by someone of lower rank, and who was deciding whether to make that clear now or later. "She ran," the officer said finally, "from the transit column. She was apprehended near the eastern perimeter." Cale looked at the child again. "Ran," the officer had said, "from a transit column." Transit columns were guarded, organized, supervised. They were lines of beings being moved from one place to another, and the people running them did not call it running when someone wandered off or got confused. They called it running when someone had made a deliberate, conscious decision to go a different direction than the one they were being taken. The child had a scrape on her left knee. The skin there was abraded, pale blue darkening to indigo where the blood was rising. Her feet were dirty. The soles were raw, not calloused, not toughened. Soft feet that had been running on hard ground. "Leave her," Cale said. The officer did not respond to that. He looked at the child one more time. the way a person looks at a piece of equipment they have requisitioned and are now storing temporarily, and then he turned and walked out through the tent flap. The two soldiers followed. The flap settled closed behind them with a sound like a held breath released. The freight handler on the cot was staring at the child, with the particular expression of a man who wanted no part of whatever was about to happen. "Am I done?" he asked. "Hold still." Cale picked up the suture scissors and cut the last 2 stitches. "Keep it clean. If it swells, come back." The freight handler left quickly. The tent was empty except for Cale and the child and the rows of cots and the surgical station and the supply cabinets and the smell of antiseptic and canvas and the dry, mineral-edged wind that pushed through every seam in the tent's fabric. The child stood exactly where she had landed. She had not moved. Her hands were at her sides, fingers curled loosely, not fists but not open either. Ready, holding something in reserve. "Are you hurt?" Cale asked. She did not answer. "I'm a medic. I fix things that are broken and clean things that are dirty, and I ask questions that are only about whether you're in pain. That's it. Nothing else." The child watched him. Her gold eyes tracked his face, his hands, the scissors he was still holding, the distance between them. She was calculating. He recognized the process. He had seen it in soldiers under fire, in wounded animals cornered in debris, in anyone whose survival had become a math problem they were solving in real time. "My name is Cale," he said. "Sergeant Cale Brecker, Terran Medical Corps, attached to this camp as a field medic. That means I work here. I take care of the people in this camp when they get hurt or sick. I've been here 11 months. I have a cot in the back of this tent, a kettle that leaks, and a very limited supply of patience for anyone who throws children on my floor." Something shifted in her expression. Not a softening, nothing about the rigidity in her body changed, but a recalculation, a variable adjusted. "Does your knee hurt?" he asked. A pause, then a nod. Small, controlled, the minimum expenditure of movement required to convey the information. "I can clean it, may I?" Another pause, longer this time, then a second nod. Cale moved slowly. He had treated children before, human children and others, and he knew the protocol was the same as treating a patient who did not trust anesthesia. Announce every action before you take it. No surprises. No sudden reaches. No closing the distance faster than the patient could track. He pulled the stool from behind the surgical station and set it down 3 meters from the child. He placed the antiseptic kit on the ground beside it, gauze, a bottle of saline solution, a tube of wound sealant, a pair of examination gloves, and he sat on the stool and opened the kit so every piece was visible. "I'll use saline first. It's water with salt. It cleans. Then I'll use this," he held up the wound sealant, "to close the scrape. It goes on cool. It doesn't sting." The child looked at the kit. She looked at his hands. She looked at the tent flap behind her, the only exit, and measured the distance. Then she walked to the stool and sat on the ground in front of him and extended her left leg. The scrape was shallow but wide. He cleaned it carefully, the saline washing away grit and dried blood, revealing the blue-white skin underneath. Up close, the translucence was remarkable. He could see the vascular network branching beneath the surface, finer and more complex than any humanoid anatomy he had studied. The child's physiology was delicate, not fragile, the distinction mattered, but built on a scale where the margins were thin. Less blood volume, thinner dermal layers, narrower bones. A species that had evolved to be precise rather than durable. She did not make a sound while he worked. She watched his hands with an intensity that suggested she was memorizing the process, not just what he did, but how, where his fingers applied pressure, how much saline he used, the angle at which he held the gauze. "You learn fast," he said. "You talk a lot," she said. It was the first thing she had said. Her voice was clear and precise, accented in a way that softened consonants and elongated vowels, and it carried the particular flatness of someone speaking a language they had learned rather than grown up inside. Occupational hazard, Cale said. Medics explain things, it keeps patients calm. I am not a patient. You have a wound I am cleaning. That makes you a patient. She considered this with the gravity of someone weighing a legal argument. Then I will be a patient until the wound is clean. Then I will be something else. Cale applied the wound sealant. It went on cool as promised, forming a thin protective layer over the abraded skin. The child flexed her knee experimentally, testing the range, the tension, whether the sealant restricted movement. It did not. She seemed satisfied. What else will you be? Cale asked. Gone. He looked at her, she looked back. Her gold eyes were steady, her expression factual. She was not making a threat or a plea. She was stating a plan. The camp perimeter is monitored, he said. Sensors, patrols, 2 layers of fencing. I came through 2 layers of fencing to get into the transit column. Getting out is easier. Cale set the used gauze aside and pulled off the examination gloves. He dropped them into the waste bin and leaned back on the stool. Where are you going? Away from the protectorate. Why? She looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, because the protectorate calls it a recovery, I call it something else. The wind pushed against the tent walls. Canvas rippled. Somewhere outside, a generator hummed the low, constant note that powered the camp's lighting grid. Cale had been in enough places to know that the word recovery could mean a great many things, and that the gap between what an authority called a thing and what the person experiencing it called the same thing was often the distance between a press release and a grave. How old are you? He asked. She paused. Not confusion, he could see her converting units, translating one system of time to another. In your counting, I think close to 8. And the transit column, where was it going? The Protectorate Intake Facility on Draven Station. What happens at the intake facility? The child said nothing, but her fingers curled tighter, not fists, not quite, but closer, and the tremors that had been running through her frame intensified by 1 degree. Cale had treated refugees before, displaced populations, evacuees, survivors of conflicts that had ended on paper but not in practice. He knew the architecture of the systems that processed them, the forms, the stations, the bureaucratic vocabulary that turned people into cases and cases into numbers and numbers into dispositions. He knew that the word intake carried different weights depending on which end of the process you were standing on. Are you hungry? He asked. The shift in topic seemed to surprise her. She blinked slow, the nictitating membrane visible for a fraction of a second, another detail of physiology he filed away, and then she nodded. He stood and walked to the supply cabinet at the back of the tent. Inside, between the sterile supply packs and the medication stores, he kept a personal kit, ration bars, a canister of dried fruit, a thermos of water, a small container of grain porridge he had made that morning and not yet eaten. He heated the porridge on the kettle plate. The kettle leaked, but the heating element worked and poured it into a tin cup. He brought it to her. She took it with both hands, curling her fingers around the cup the way someone holds a thing they expect to have taken away. She drank carefully, in measured sips, and Cale recognized the discipline of a body that had been hungry long enough to know that speed was the enemy. The sealant on your knee should hold for 3 days, he said, sitting back down on the stool. If it starts to peel, you can reapply. The tube is in the kit. She drank, she said nothing. The retrieval unit is coming before nightfall. The officer said so. She stopped drinking. Her eyes came up over the rim of the cup. I know what the retrieval unit does, she said. Tell me. They collect Laurian minors who have been displaced. They return them to Protectorate custody. The Protectorate places them in intake processing. Intake processing assigns them to indenture contracts. She said the words indenture contracts with the precision of someone repeating a phrase they had been told many times by people who wanted it to sound ordinary. "You've been through this before," Cale said. "Twice I was placed twice. I ran twice. This is the third time they have caught me." Cale was quiet for a moment. The wind was picking up outside, the canvas walls snapping in irregular intervals, dust hissing against the fabric. "What happens on the third time?" "On the third recovery, the protectorate designates the minor as persistent noncompliant. Persistent noncompliant minors are transferred to closed facilities. Closed facilities do not have windows." She said it the way she had said everything else. Factual, measured, with the vocabulary of a system she understood intimately and wanted no part of. Cale looked at the tent flap. Beyond it, the camp stretched in ordered rows, housing units, supply depots, the administrative block, the communications tower. 2,000 people lived in this camp: soldiers, contractors, refugees, medical staff, logistics personnel. The camp was a waypoint, a place people passed through on their way to somewhere else. Nobody stayed. Nobody was meant to. He was meant to be a waypoint too, a function, a medical facility with a rank and a name attached. The child had been delivered to him like a package to be stored, and the expectation was that he would store it until someone came to collect it. Cale had spent 14 years in the service. He had followed orders across 3 deployments, 2 conflicts, and 1 peacekeeping operation that had been peaceful for everyone, except the people being kept. He had learned that the system worked because people inside it did what they were told, and did not ask the questions that would require them to do something about the answers. He was asking the questions now. And the answers were sitting on his floor, drinking porridge from a tin cup, with a sealed scrape on one knee and gold eyes that had already seen the inside of a closed facility, and decided, at 8 years old, that she would rather run through 2 layers of fencing than see it again. "What's your name?" he asked. "Why?" "Because I'm going to need it for the form." She set the cup down. Her expression did not change, but something behind it did, a tightening, a withdrawal, the beginning of a shutdown. She had heard forms before. Forms were the tools of the system, and the system was the thing she ran from. "The medical intake form," Cale said. "I'm a medic. You're in my tent with an injury I treated. That makes you a patient, which means I'm required to fill out a medical intake form, and medical intake forms have a field for the patient's name." She stared at him. "A medical intake form," she repeated. "Not a recovery form." "No, a medical intake form, different authority, my authority." He pulled a tablet from the surgical station and activated the screen. Name, species, presenting injury, treatment administered, medic's assessment, medic's recommendation for continued care. That's it. She was quiet for a long time. The wind pulled at the tent. The generator hummed. "Sevi," she said. "My name is Sevi." He entered it into the form. Name, Sevi, species, Larian, presenting injury, dermal abrasion, left knee. Treatment, saline irrigation, wound sealant application. Medic's assessment. Patient is a minor, presenting with signs of sustained physical stress, inadequate nutrition, and exposure consistent with displacement conditions. He paused at the last field. Medic's recommendation for continued care. He typed, "Patient requires extended medical observation. Minimum 72 hours. Patient is not cleared for transfer or transport until observation period is complete and follow-up assessment confirms stable condition." SGT. Cale Brecker, Terran Medical Corps, License 4471 TM. He saved the form. The timestamp was 14:07 local. The retrieval unit was arriving before nightfall. Nightfall was 5 hours away. 72 hours was not 5 hours. The child, Sevi, watched him save the form. She could not read the screen from where she sat, but she could read his face, and whatever she saw there made her pick the cup back up and take another sip of porridge. "That form," she said, "does it have authority?" "It has my authority. I'm the ranking medical officer in this camp. If a patient is under my medical hold, they don't get transferred until I clear them. And you are not going to clear me. Not until I've completed my observation period, 72 hours minimum." "What happens in 72 hours?" "Medically, I observe you. I make sure the scrape heals, check your nutrition levels, monitor for any signs of stress-related illness. I do my job." "And then?" Cale looked at her. The honest answer was that he did not know. 72 hours bought time, but time was not a solution. The Protectorate had filed a recovery order. The camp administration would comply. The retrieval unit would wait, or they would file a complaint, or they would escalate, and eventually the chain of command would produce someone with enough rank to override a field medic's hold order, and the math would end where it always ended. The system was bigger than one person. But he did not say any of that. He said, "In 72 hours I will think of something." Sevi set the cup down. Empty. She placed it on the ground beside her with a care that suggested she was unused to having things, and treated the temporary possession of a tin cup as a contract she intended to honor. "That is not a plan," she said. "No. It's a promise. Those are different things. Yes, plans can fail. Promises are choices." The retrieval unit arrived at 16:40 local, 3 hours and 20 minutes before nightfall. There were two of them, Larian officials in dark formal coats that looked wrong against the dust and canvas of the medical camp. Their skin was the same blue-white as Sevi's but darker, the translucence less pronounced, the way an adult of the species differed from a child. Denser, more opaque, as though time layered itself into the dermis. They carried tablets and authorization documents, and the particular air of people who expected compliance the way a river expected downhill. Sevi saw them through the tent wall. The canvas was thin enough that silhouettes were legible, and she had been watching the entrance since Cale filed the form. When the shapes appeared, too tall, thin, moving with the unhurried gait of authority, she went still. Not the calculated stillness from before. Something deeper. The stillness of a prey animal that has heard the particular footstep it has been listening for. "Stay on the cot," Cale said. He had moved her to a cot 30 minutes after the porridge, a proper patient, in a proper bed, with a proper medical chart hanging from the frame. He had checked her vitals using the tent's diagnostic equipment. Heart rate elevated but functional, body temperature 2 degrees below humanoid baseline, which his limited Larian medical references suggested was normal for a juvenile of her species. Blood chemistry showing markers consistent with sustained caloric deficit and mild dehydration. All of it documented, all of it filed. He was building a wall out of paperwork, and he knew it, and the child knew it, and they both understood that walls made of paperwork held only as long as the person standing behind them refused to move. The tent flap opened. The two officials entered. Behind them, visible for a moment before the flap closed, the gray-armored officer from before, watching. "Sergeant Brecker," the first official said. Female, tall, her voice carrying the same softened consonants as Sevi's, but with a formality that turned the accent into something colder. "I am Administrator Valeth, Larian Protectorate Recovery Division. This is my associate, Administrator Den. We are here to collect minor designation Sevilur 7, per Recovery Order 4418C, filed this morning with Camp Administration." "I'm aware of the order." "Then, you understand we require the minor released into our custody." "I understand the request. I'm unable to comply at this time." The silence that followed was specific. Cale had heard it before. The silence of a bureaucratic process encountering an unexpected variable and attempting to categorize it. "Unable," Administrator Valeth repeated. "The minor is under medical hold." I treated an injury upon her arrival and initiated a 72-hour observation period. Standard protocol for a minor presenting with signs of sustained physical stress, caloric deficit, and displacement-related exposure. The hold is active. She cannot be transferred or transported until I complete my assessment and issue a clearance. A scraped knee, Administrator Kale Den said. He had read the form. You are placing a medical hold on the basis of a scraped knee. I'm placing a medical hold on the basis of my clinical judgment as the ranking medical officer in this facility. The scrape is the presenting injury. The underlying assessment includes malnutrition indicators, dehydration markers, elevated stress response, and a body temperature that falls within normal range for her species, but requires monitoring in an environment where ambient temperature is not controlled for Lurian physiology. He could feel Sevi watching him from the cot. He did not look at her. He kept his eyes on the administrators and his voice in the register he used when delivering clinical findings to officers who wanted a different answer. Even, factual, unassailable. Administrator Valeth studied him. Her gold eyes, the same shade as Sevi's, Kale noticed. The same luminous clarity moved across his face with the precision of a diagnostic scan. Sergeant, I want to be direct. This minor is a repeat absconder. She has been recovered twice before and has demonstrated persistent noncompliance with protectorate placement. Our mandate is to return her to custody before further incident occurs. Your medical hold, however well-intentioned, delays that process and exposes the minor to continued risk. Risk of what? Of remaining unprocessed, of existing outside the system designed to protect her. Kale let that sentence sit in the air for a moment. Then he said, my medical hold stands, 72 hours. After that, I will reassess. This will be escalated. I expect it will. Your commanding officer will be contacted. Lieutenant Commander Hess, Communications Block, 2nd row. She's usually there by 1800. Administrator Valeth held his gaze for 3 seconds longer than necessary, long enough to communicate that the interaction was being recorded, filed, and would have consequences, and then she turned and left. Administrator Den followed. The tent flap closed. Kale exhaled. It was not a sigh. Medics did not sigh in front of patients, but it was close. 72 hours, Sevi said from the cot. That's what the form says. They will come back. Yes. With someone who can override your form. Probably. Sevi pulled the thin blanket he had given her up to her chin. She was looking at the tent ceiling, her gold eyes tracing the seams where the canvas panels joined. Why are you doing this? It was the first question she had asked that was not tactical. Not where are you going, not what happens next, not what does the form say. Why? The question under all the others. Kale sat on the stool beside the cot. He rested his forearms on his knees and looked at his hands, the hands that had sutured and splinted and cleaned and held and pressed and stitched for 14 years, the hands that were steady when things around them were not, the hands that were currently the only barrier between an 8-year-old girl and a system that called what it did to her a recovery. Because I'm a medic, he said. And medics don't release patients into conditions that will harm them. The Protectorate says the conditions are lawful. Lawful and harmful are not mutually exclusive. She considered this. Then she said, you are going to get in trouble. Probably. Bad trouble. I've been in trouble before. I have a talent for it. The wind was dying down. The afternoon light was shifting, the harsh white of midday softening toward the amber of late afternoon. Through the canvas, Kale could see the shadows lengthening across the camp. At dusk, Sevi stood at the tent flap. She did not touch it. She stood 2 steps from the canvas with her bare feet angled toward the exit and her body carrying the particular tension of a runner on a starting line. She had done the math. Cale could see it in the way her gold eyes moved, counting the distance to the perimeter, the intervals between the floodlight sweeps, the number of seconds she had before the next patrol passed the eastern fence. She had been doing this math her entire life. It was the only algebra that had ever kept her alive. He did not move to stop her. He did not stand up. He did not position himself between her and the flap. He stayed on the stool, 6 meters away, and he said, "The sealant on your knee won't hold if you run on packed ground. It needs 12 more hours to cure." She stood at the flap for a long time. The camp sounds filtered through the canvas, boots on gravel, the clatter of mess kits, a generator cycling to nighttime output. The shadows stretched. The floodlights clicked on, throwing hard white light across the rows of tents, and the sudden brightness made Sevi's pupils contract to thin vertical slits. Another Lurian trait, Cale noted, another detail of a physiology built for precision. She did not run. She turned around, walked back to the cot, and pulled the blanket over her shoulders. She did not explain. She did not thank him. She lay on her side facing the tent wall and curled her knees to her chest and was very, very still. It was the first time she had chosen to stay somewhere instead of choosing to leave. Cale understood the weight of that. He filed no form for it. Some things did not fit on forms. He spent the first night on the floor beside the cot. Not because it was required. His own cot was 6 meters away. But because at 0200 local, Sevi had woken up shaking hard enough that the cot frame rattled, and the sound she was not making was louder than any sound he had ever heard. He sat on the ground beside her and did nothing. He did not touch her, did not speak, did not try to calm her down. He sat close enough that she could feel the warmth of another body and far enough that she could choose whether or not to close the distance. After 11 minutes, he counted. She turned on the cot to face him, and the shaking decreased by half, and eventually she slept again. In the morning, he heated porridge and they ate together. She ate precisely, methodically, and she watched him eat with the same intensity she brought to everything, cataloging, learning, storing. When she finished, she placed the cup on the floor beside the cot and said, 23. 23 what? Sips, I counted, 23 sips of porridge. Is that significant? I count things, it helps. When things are uncertain, I count what is real. Cale looked at her. What else do you count? Steps to the tent flap. 14. Seconds between guard rotations outside. 170. Rivets in the ceiling panel above this cot. 41. Heartbeats per minute for your species. 62. Yours specifically. 62 at rest. 78 when the administrators were speaking. Cale felt something shift in his chest, not quite a crack, more like a weight being redistributed. This child had survived by paying attention. Every number was a weapon or an escape route, or a small anchor holding her to the real in a world that kept trying to make her disappear. Mine specifically, he said. I listen. Lurian hearing is very precise. I'm aware. That afternoon, Sevi asked him to teach her to clean wounds. It was a practical request, delivered with practical language. If I need to run again, I should know how to do what you did. But Cale heard the thing underneath it. She was planning for a future that did not include him. She had been planning for futures that did not include anyone for a long time. He taught her anyway. He showed her saline irrigation, gauze pressure, wound sealant application. She watched each step once, then replicated it on a practice pad with a precision that made him suspect Lurian motor memory was significantly more acute than the medical literature suggested. Her hands were steady, steadier than his had been at her age, steadier than some field medics he had trained. You're good at this, he said. I am good at learning things that keep me alive. Most people would not describe wound care as survival training. Most people have not been in a closed facility. He let that settle. Then he said, what did you learn in the closed facility? She was quiet for a moment, her fingers still on the practice pad, the sealant tube balanced in her palm. That 14,400 seconds is the time between lights off and lights on. That the walls are 9 steps by 7 steps. That the ventilation cycle runs for 40 seconds every 12 minutes. That the food slot opens at 6,000 seconds after lights on, exactly. And if you are not at the slot when it opens, the food is retracted after 30 seconds and does not return until the next cycle. She listed these facts without inflection. They were data. They were the numbers she had counted in a place with no windows, because counting was the thing that held her together when everything else was designed to take her apart. That sound carries through the ventilation ducts, she continued. That some children count out loud, that some children stop counting. The wind moved through the tent. Cale's hands, which had been steady for 14 years, were not steady now. He pressed them flat against his knees and breathed and waited until they were. "You counted," he said. "I always count." Late that afternoon, a supply drone dropped a crate of medical restocks outside the tent. Cale inventoried the contents: analgesic packs, suture kits, antiseptic concentrate, sterile dressings, and stacked them in the cabinet with the systematic disorganization of a man who knew where things were but could not explain his filing system to anyone else. Sevi watched him for 4 minutes. Then she said, "You put the dressings behind the analgesics. The dressings are used 4 times more frequently." He looked at her. She looked at the cabinet. Her gold eyes tracked the shelves with the focus of someone reading a language she was fluent in. "If you sort by frequency of access, dressings first, then antiseptic, then suture kits, then analgesics, then specialized, you reduce the average reach time by approximately 2 seconds per item. In an emergency with 3 simultaneous patients, that is 6 seconds saved per supply cycle. 6 seconds is 1.2 heartbeats at your resting rate." Cale blinked. "You calculated restocking efficiency in terms of my heartbeats." "I use consistent units." He stepped aside. She reorganized the entire cabinet in 22 minutes. Every item was accessible, labeled by her own shorthand annotations scratched onto adhesive strips with a stylus she had taken from the surgical station, grouped by urgency and cross-referenced with the treatment protocols pinned to the tent wall. When she finished, she sat back on her heels and looked at the result with the expression of a person who had imposed order on a small piece of the world and found it satisfying. "Better," she said. "It was." Cale opened and closed 3 drawers to confirm. Each one gave him exactly what he needed on the first reach. "Significantly better," he admitted. She looked at him. Something in her expression, not a smile, not yet, but the architecture of a place where a smile might eventually be built, shifted. The escalation came at 10:30 the next morning. Lieutenant Commander Hess appeared at the tent flap, a compact woman with cropped gray hair and an expression that suggested she had been having a difficult morning, and Cale was not improving it. "Brecker, Commander, I have 2 Lorraine Protectorate administrators in my office. They have a recovery order signed by a Protectorate magistrate. They have a camp administration compliance agreement. They have a formal objection filed against your medical hold. They have requested that I order you to release the minor immediately. And I'm here to ask you what the hell you're doing." Cale handed her the tablet with the medical intake form, the clinical assessment, the vitals log, and the 72-hour hold order. Hess read it. She was a thorough reader. Cale had worked under her for 11 months and knew that she read every document she was given, which was why she was always having difficult mornings. "Caloric deficit," she said. "Documented." "Dehydration markers." "Documented." "Elevated stress response." "Documented." "And your clinical recommendation is 72-hour observation. Minimum. I may extend it if the follow-up assessment indicates continued instability." Hess looked at him over the tablet. She had been in the service longer than he had, 22 years to his 14, and her eyes carried the particular weariness of someone who understood that every decision she made existed on a spectrum between following the rules and doing the right thing, and that the two were not always on the same end. The Protectorate has legal authority over their displaced minors, Brecker. I can't ignore a magistrate's order. You can't override a medical hold either. Terran Medical Corps Regulation 14.7. A ranking medical officer's hold on a patient cannot be countermanded by non-medical authority. The patient stays until the medic clears them. You're going to stand on 14.7. I'm going to stand on the fact that I have a child in my tent who has been through 3 forced recovery operations, who is malnourished, dehydrated, and whose stress response is consistent with prolonged exposure to conditions I would not clear an adult for, let alone a juvenile. My hold is clinically justified. And the fact that she's 8 years old and you don't want to hand her to people who will put her in a closed facility, that's not part of it. Kale met her eyes. That is the clinical assessment, Commander. A closed facility, by the Protectorate's own documentation, provides no natural light, restricted movement, and punitive isolation protocols for non-compliant minors. Placing a malnourished, dehydrated juvenile with an elevated stress response into those conditions constitutes a foreseeable harm. I am not required to release a patient into foreseeable harm. Regulation 14.7. Hess held the tablet for a long time, then she handed it back. I'll inform the Protectorate administrators that the hold is active and will be reviewed at the completion of the observation period. Thank you, Commander. Don't thank me, you've made my morning significantly worse. She paused at the tent flap. Brecker. Commander. Your hold buys 72 hours. After that, the math changes. You understand that? I understand. She left, the tent flap settled. Kale turned back to find Sevi sitting upright on the cot, her knees drawn to her chest, her gold eyes fixed on him. Regulation 14.7, she said. Yes. You memorized a regulation to keep me here. I memorized it 4 years ago. A different patient, a different camp, a different situation. The regulation was the same. Did it work then? It bought time. And after the time, I found a better answer. What was the answer? That's a different story. Sevi looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, I count things because the numbers don't change. People change. Systems change. But 62 heartbeats per minute stays 62. And what does that tell you? That you were not afraid. Your heart did not change when the administrators came or when your commander came. 78 is not afraid. 78 is working. Kale sat down on the stool. He did not know what to say to that, so he said nothing, and the silence between them was not awkward or heavy, but simply present. The silence of two people who were inside the same problem and had decided, separately and together, that they were not going to solve it by talking. On the second day, the Protectorate sent a legal representative. She arrived with a briefcase and a translator device, and a manner that suggested she had resolved many situations like this one, and expected to resolve this one quickly. Her name was Counselor Turith, and she was efficient. She presented the recovery order, the magistrate's signature, the jurisdictional authority of the Lurian Protectorate over displaced Lurian nationals, the camp administration's compliance agreement, and a formal challenge to the medical hold citing insufficient clinical basis. Kale presented the updated vitals log. He had taken readings every 6 hours, blood chemistry, hydration levels, body temperature, caloric intake, stress hormone markers. Each reading was time-stamped, documented, and annotated with his clinical notes. The patient's cortisol equivalent markers remain elevated, he said. Her caloric intake over the past 36 hours has improved her blood chemistry, but remains insufficient for a Lurian juvenile of her approximate developmental stage. Her hydration levels are approaching baseline but have not stabilized. My clinical judgment is that the observation period should be extended. Extended, Counselor Turith said. By how long? An additional 48 hours, pending reassessment. You understand that the Protectorate's patience is not infinite, Sergeant. I understand that my patient's health is not negotiable. Counselor Turith studied him. Her expression was the look of someone who understood she was dealing not with defiance but with stubbornness, and that the two were different in ways that mattered. Defiance could be broken. Stubbornness had to be waited out. I will report your extension to the Protectorate, she said. Be advised that further delays will result in a formal complaint to Terran Command and a request for your replacement as the attending medical officer. Understood. She left, the tent flap closed. Sevi was sitting on the cot with her legs crossed, sorting a handful of wound sealant tubes that Kale had given her to organize. She had arranged them by size, then by manufacturing date, then by remaining contents, holding each one up to the surgical light and estimating the fill level with a precision that would have impressed his supply officer. They will replace you, she said. They might. If they replace you, the new medic will not keep the hold. That's a possibility. Then the hold is a wall with a crack in it. Kale looked at her. What would you do with a wall that has a crack? Patch it or find a different wall. I'm working on the different wall. She arranged the last tube in line. You are filing a formal guardianship petition under Terran Humanitarian Code Section 9. Kale stared at her. I read your tablet, she said. When you went to heat porridge this morning, the screen was unlocked. You read my tablet. You left it face up on the surgical station. I can read Terran Standard. The Protectorate teaches it in intake processing. It is considered a useful vocational skill. Kale sat down slowly. He had not told anyone about the petition. He had drafted it at 03:00 the previous night, working from memory of the code and the templates he had seen used twice before in his career. Both times by aid workers, both times on behalf of displaced children, both times in situations where the lawful authority's definition of protection and the child's definition of survival did not overlap. Section 9 allows a Terran citizen to petition for temporary humanitarian guardianship of a displaced minor when the petitioner can demonstrate that the minor faces foreseeable harm from the custodial authority, Sevi said, reciting the language with the same precision she brought to counting heartbeats. The petition must be filed with a Terran magistrate and can take between 4 and 14 days to adjudicate. During adjudication, the minor cannot be transferred. You memorized it. I counted the words, 312 in the full section. Sevi. I count things, she said, and sometimes the things I count matter very much. On the third day, the gray-armored officer returned. He did not come alone. Behind him were 4 soldiers, not camp security, not administrative personnel, but uniformed soldiers with sidearms and the particular posture of people who had been given an order and intended to execute it. Sergeant Brecker, the officer said, I have authorization from Protectorate Regional Command, countersigned by camp administration, to remove the minor Sevilur 7 from your medical facility. Your hold has been formally challenged and is under review. Pending review, the minor is to be placed in administrative custody. Kale stood in the center of the tent. Behind him, Sevi was on the cot. She had not moved. Her hands were flat on the mattress, her body very still, her gold eyes watching the soldiers with the fixed attention of someone who had been through this before and knew exactly how it ended. My hold is active, Kale said. Your hold is under review. Under review is not overturned. The hold remains active until a Terran medical authority formally countermands it. Sergeant, I am authorized. You are authorized to request compliance. You are not authorized to enter a medical facility and remove a patient against the attending medic's orders. Terran Medical Corps Regulation 14-7. The patient is under my care. She stays. The officer looked at the soldiers. The soldiers looked at Kale. The distance between them was 8 meters. The tent was 12 meters long. There were 2 exits, the front flap and the supply hatch at the rear, and both were blocked. Kale was aware of several things simultaneously. That he was unarmed, that he was outranked, that he was outnumbered, that his medical hold was a piece of paperwork on a tablet screen, and these were people with weapons and orders, and that none of that mattered because the child behind him had run 3 times and been caught 3 times, and the next time would be the last time, and he was not going to be the person who let that happen. He also became aware that he was not alone. The freight handler he had treated 2 days ago was standing at the tent flap. Behind him, 3 more camp workers, a water system technician, a generator mechanic, a supply depot clerk, all of them people Kale had treated over the past 11 months for the small injuries and illnesses that camp life produced. Behind them, visible through the canvas, more shapes, people, coming toward the medical tent, not marching, not rushing. Walking the way people walked when they had heard something and decided to be present. The kid stays, the freight handler said. He was large Toralin with the recently sutured forearm and a voice that carried. The doc says she stays, she stays. The water technician, a wiry woman with chemical-stained hands and a permanent squint from years of working under fluorescent maintenance lights, stepped up beside the freight handler. I was here when they threw her in. Threw. A child. I heard it from 2 tents over. The officer looked at the growing crowd. His jaw tightened. A communications specialist Kale had treated for migraines moved through the press of bodies. She held up a comm tablet. Camp network's been busy, Sergeant. Turns out there's an open channel regulation database on the Terran military subnet. Someone may have forwarded Regulation 14-7 to every terminal in the camp about an hour ago. Someone, Kale said. No idea who. Definitely wasn't me. I have migraines. Lieutenant Commander Hess appeared. She looked at the soldiers, the crowd, the officer, and Kale, and her expression said that this morning was significantly worse than the last one. What is happening here? She asked. Commander, the officer began. I was asking Sergeant Brecker. Kale said, a patient is under my medical hold. These soldiers are attempting to remove her. I am declining. Hess looked at him. She looked at the crowd. She looked at the child on the cot, small, still, with gold eyes that watched everything and counted everything and forgot nothing. Sergeant Brecker filed a petition under Terran Humanitarian Code Section 9 this morning at 04:12, Hess said. I countersigned it and forwarded it to the Terran Magistrate's office at 06:00. During adjudication, the minor cannot be transferred. The petition creates a legal hold that supersedes both the medical hold and the Protectorate's recovery order. She looked at the officer. Your authorization is void. The minor stays. The silence lasted 6 seconds. Sevi would have counted them. The officer left. The soldiers followed. The crowd lingered for a while, the freight handler giving Kale a nod that communicated approval without requiring words, the water technician patting the tent frame as though reassuring the structure itself. And then they dispersed, and the tent was quiet again. Kale sat on the stool. His hands were shaking. Not much, a fine tremor, barely visible, but enough that he noticed. 20 minutes later, Administrator Valeth returned alone. No soldiers, no legal representative, just one Larian official standing at the tent flap with an expression that had shifted from bureaucratic patience to something more personal. You understand, she said, that the Protectorate will not let this stand. We have recovered this child 3 times. We have legal mandate. We have precedent. We have resources that a field medic with a regulation and a leaking kettle does not have." "I understand all of that," Cale said. "Then you understand that you are delaying the inevitable." "I'm not delaying anything. I'm doing something different." Valith looked at Sevi on the cot. For the first time, her expression was not administrative. It was something Cale could not immediately categorize: regret, perhaps, or the particular weariness of someone who had been inside a system long enough to see what it did but not long enough to stop seeing it. "The Protectorate is not what you think it is," she said quietly. "I think it's a system that calls indenture contracts a placement and calls closed facilities a consequence and calls recovery what every child who runs from it calls something else entirely. I don't need to think anything. The child told me." Valith stood at the flap for a moment longer. Then she left. And this time, the tent flap closed with a finality that suggested she would not be back. When he looked up, Sevi was watching his hands with the same attention she gave to everything. "Your heartbeat was 94, she said. "Was it?" "That is the highest I have recorded." "I was working very hard." She looked at him. The expression on her face was something he had not seen there before, not the calculation, not the defiance, not the tactical readiness. Something softer, something that had been locked behind the counting and the watching and the running for a very long time, and was now, carefully, cautiously, with the wariness of a creature testing ground that had broken under it before, emerging. "I counted the people," she said, 22. "They came because of you. They came because of you. They don't know me. They know what it looks like when someone decides a child matters." Sevi pulled the blanket around her shoulders. She looked at the tent ceiling, the 41 rivets, the canvas seams, the particular pattern of stitching that held the whole structure together. "When I am in the closed facility," she said very quietly, "I count the seconds between the lights going off and the lights coming on. It is always the same, 14,400, exactly. Every night. The system does not vary." "How many nights?" "Enough to know that 14,400 seconds is a very long time to be alone in the dark." Cale was quiet. The tent walls breathed with the wind. "You won't be counting those seconds again," he said. She looked at him. Her gold eyes were steady, and the tremors in her frame had stopped, and her hands, which had been curled and ready, and holding something in reserve since the moment she had landed on his floor, were open. "I know," she said. "Your heartbeat told me." The adjudication took 9 days. On the 4th day, the Protectorate filed a formal objection. On the 5th, the Terran Magistrate's office requested supporting documentation, and Cale submitted 47 pages of medical records, clinical assessments, and a detailed brief on Lurian Protectorate intake conditions, compiled from publicly available Protectorate administrative reports that the Protectorate had presumably not expected anyone to actually read. On the 6th, Councillor Turith returned with a counterfiling arguing that Terran humanitarian law did not extend jurisdiction over Lurian nationals. Cale responded with a precedent case from 7 years prior, a Terran engineer who had successfully petitioned for guardianship of 3 displaced Selhari children on a joint jurisdiction station, ruling upheld on appeal. On the 7th day, the magistrate scheduled a hearing. On the 8th, Sevi organized every supply in the medical tent by category, subcategory, expiration date, and frequency of use, producing an inventory system more efficient than anything Cale had managed in 11 months. She also reorganized the patient intake forms into a filing system that cross-referenced presenting injuries with treatment protocols and follow-up schedules. She had a talent for systems, not the kind that processed people into numbers, but the kind that made sure the right thing was in the right place when someone needed it. On the 9th day, the hearing concluded. The temporary guardianship was granted. The recovery order was suspended. The Protectorate filed an appeal. The appeal would take months. Months were not seconds, Months were not transit columns. Months were not closed facilities. Months were time, and time was the thing Cale had promised, and the promise was a choice, and the choice was made. On the morning the order came through, Sevi was sitting on the cot sorting wound sealant tubes into the system she had devised. She was humming, low, barely audible, a pattern of notes that Cale had never heard before. He had not heard her make a sound that was not words or silence. The humming was new. It was the sound of someone whose body had decided before her mind caught up that she was somewhere the sound could come out. Cale handed her the tablet with the magistrate's ruling on the screen. She read it once, quickly, then again, slowly, and then a third time with the particular attention of someone making sure the words would not rearrange themselves into something different when she looked away. "Temporary," she said. "For now. We'll work on permanent. That will require more forms. I have a talent for forms. You have a talent for trouble, you said so. Both, they're related." She set the tablet down. She looked at him for a long moment, and then she did something she had never done before. She reached out and placed one small hand on his forearm. Her fingers were cool, Lyrian body temperature, 2 degrees below baseline, and her grip was light, almost weightless, the touch of someone for whom physical contact was a language she was relearning after a long silence. She did not say anything. She did not need to. The hand said it. "I am here. You are here. The count has changed." Cale placed his hand over hers, warm over cool, steady over still. A medic's hand, scarred, competent, 14 years of holding things together, covering a child's hand that had been holding itself together for far too long. Outside, the camp continued. The generator hummed. The wind moved through the canvas. The light shifted. And in a medical tent on a frontier that most of the galaxy would never think about, 2 people sat together in a silence that was not empty but full of numbers that had been counted and seconds that had been survived, and the particular, irreducible fact that one human being had decided that one child was not a case file or a designation or a problem to be stored, but a person, small and whole and worth the trouble. The trouble had only begun. Cale knew that. The protectorate would appeal. The bureaucracy would grind. The forms would multiply. And Cale Brecker, field medic, suture cutter, keeper of a leaking kettle and a limited supply of patients, would meet every form with another form, every challenge with another regulation, every attempt to make a child disappear into a system with the simple, immovable fact of a man who had decided to stay. He looked at Sevi. She was already organizing the next shelf, her gold eyes focused, her silver-white hair catching the afternoon light, her bare feet tucked beneath her on the cot, the sealed scrape on her knee almost healed. She was counting something under her breath, the bolts on the supply cabinet, the items on the shelf, the things that were real and present and did not change. 62, she said without looking up. What? Your heartbeat. 62, resting. Is that good? It is consistent. You are the most consistent thing I have counted. Cale leaned back on the stool and looked at the ceiling. 41 rivets. He had never noticed before. He was beginning to understand that counting things was not about numbers. It was about trust. You counted what you believed would still be there when you counted again. Sevi counted rivets and heartbeats and sips of porridge because the world had taught her that everything else could be taken. He intended to be a thing she counted, not because it was his job, not because a regulation required it, not because a form said so, because a child had landed on his floor and she had not flinched, and he was not the kind of man who could walk past that. 62 beats per minute. Consistent, reliable, present. He was going to make sure she never had to count to 14,400 in the dark again.